Hello and welcome to week 3 in the course. This week we're going to be really diving into the pieces of an argument and learning what makes up a strong and solid argument. You'll be reading chapter 4, and for sure the most difficult task this week is really understanding assumptions and breaking down an argument. So as you get into chapter 4, pay particular attention to the underlying assumptions and identifying underlying assumptions section of the chapter, because that will really help you with the worksheet that you're going to complete in the course. So let's talk about the pieces of an argument. The course is going to ask you to rely on 3 key elements. Those elements are conclusions, which is the point or the main claim or the argument, the reasons that support the argument, and the assumptions. And they're kind of tricky to find, especially assumptions. I really like in the text how they talk about how assumptions are like solving a mystery. You really have to sort of glean what the assumptions are, even though they're not directly stated. And they give you this great example of e-scooter fatalities and the need to increase regulations on scooters. So if you look at that argument, the chapter talks about how there must be some assumptions in order to buy the argument that cities should increase regulations on scooters. We have to assume that riders aren't using scooters safely because fatalities have occurred, there are increased emergency room visits, and civilians are complaining. So scooters are not being used appropriately, right? That's the assumption. The other assumption is that if we put increased regulations on scooters, then people are going to be better about riding scooters because they fear the punishment that comes with the regulation. So none of that is stated in the argument. It's all assumed in order for the argument to be effective. So as you read the chapter, go slowly through these sections and really try to understand what an assumption is and what is a conclusion and what is a reason, because you're going to in the next section look at this handout that asks you to identify those 3 parts in 6 different arguments. So it defines them for you, right? For each argument below, identify the writer's conclusion and reasons. There can be more than one. Look for signal words for conclusion, therefore, thus, and reason signal words like because and since. And then again, remember that you're looking for what the person making the argument must believe to make their argument convincing. And go back to the e-scooter example. If I argue that cities need to have more regulations, then I must believe that scooters are not being used effectively and people will be better if they fear punishment. And they give you this example with Mary Oliver. So let's do the first one together and then you'll do the other 5. Remember that you're underlining the conclusion, parentheses around the reason, and then identifying the assumption or assumptions. So number 1 says, sure, online shoppers are legally required to pay the sales tax when they file their annual income tax returns. But the vast majority don't bother because states and cities can't easily track online sales. So I first want to break down the argument. So when I look at that, I ask myself, what are they claiming? What is their point, essentially? And their point is that the vast majority of online shoppers don't bother to pay sales tax, right? So I would underline the vast majority don't bother. Why? Well, I have a signal word because states and cities can't easily track online sales. So my reason in parentheses becomes because states and cities can't easily track online sales. So that's why online shoppers are not paying sales tax. So then I have to step back and ask myself, what must I believe in order to make that argument convincing? Well, there's a couple of assumptions I have to believe. I have to believe that if people aren't held accountable, they will not do what they're supposed to do. So given the option to pay or not pay, and nobody is checking up on them, then online shoppers will not pay, right? Nobody's keeping track, so they're not going to do it. So that's an assumption I have about human nature. The other assumption I have is that people will only act out of fear of punishment, again with our e-scooters, right? If they fear that they're going to be tracked, then they might pay their online taxes, right? Or their online sales taxes. So people's behavior is motivated by fear of punishment. And then when they have no punishment or fear no consequence, then they're not going to do what they're supposed to do. So those are my assumptions, right? In order to make that argument correct. So go slowly through these as you look and sort of dissect. Imagine that you are the person making this claim. And if you are this person, what do you have to believe in order to be convincing in this argument? And that will really help you identify assumptions. It's tricky. Keep going back to the chapter and reading that section again if you get stuck. But I think this question here on the handout is the most important. Ask what the person making the argument must believe to make the argument convincing. And remember that the assumptions will not be stated. They are what isn't stated, what has to be brought to the table in order for the argument to be true. Other than that, you'll work on other types of persuasion like advertisements, but this will be a really core idea for us as we begin making our own arguments in the course. Good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.